way back to the era of the beeper in Silicon Valley. But before I do that, I want to explain to you how I got to Silicon Valley as an outsider in the first place. In 1985, I was a young photojournalist covering the famine in Ethiopia for Newsweek. I was just devastated by the level of suffering, the scale of human suffering that I saw. And I'd been a news photographer for quite some time. But you go into a camp and photograph a child, and they would actually die while you were taking the picture. On my return to the US, I began to rethink my life and what I was doing. And I started to think if I could find something hopeful to photograph for the human race and for meaning in my own life. I was having an existential crisis, my first. And then I heard that Steve Jobs had been forced out at Apple, and that from the height of fame and power, he was going to start over, and he was going to make a supercomputer that would transform education. And that got my attention. I thought, this could be the hopeful story. He was going to make a comeback, and I think the stakes couldn't have been higher for him. And I reached out to Steve, and I asked him if I could document the creation of the next computer from the early days to shipping the product. And I wanted to capture some of his process of innovation with his team and how they built a company, because Steve was kind of an avatar for what was going on in the Valley. And remember, I was an outsider. I knew nothing about technology at the time. Amazingly, Steve agreed, gave me complete access. And then he agreed to let me do it for Life magazine. So I had a 2.5, 3-year assignment. I spent 3 years total, really full-time, working hard on Next. And then because Steve trusted me, other people in the Valley did. And I was able to gain access to almost all the leading innovators and some of the most cool companies at the time. I ended up shooting 15 years, 250,000 negatives, and over 70 companies. When the dot-com collapse came, I put my film in boxes and I walked away. Some years later, Stanford Library approached me and acquired the archive and began to scan it to make it available for scholars and historians. And then a few years ago, I started to work with them to raise money, and we began scanning and researching the material and putting it together to create, because now we're going to create a film and a book and an exhibit that tours. And I'm interviewing the people I photographed back in the day, and it's very interesting. And we're going to create a education program as well at the end to inspire the next generation of engineers and entrepreneurs, which is why I can show you today now a snippet, a little teaser of this project, some of the pictures from that. The story begins with Steve, as I said. This is the day that Ross Perot came in to give Steve $20 million to help fund the start of Next. They found this abandoned warehouse in Fremont, and Steve told Ross at this formal luncheon that they created to pitch him that he was going to build the world's most advanced robotic assembly line. They were going to sell 10,000 computers a month, $1 billion a year. Steve put on this beautiful demo, and Ross gave him the money. He was on a reform. He was trying to reform education as well, so they fell in love with each other at that moment. Later, Ross said it was the worst mistake he ever made because the hardware failed. But this is Steve explaining his theory of 10-year technology development cycles and how the next computer was going to ride that wave. He was trying to take the power of a mainframe and put it in a 1-foot cube. It was a challenge from Paul Berg at Stanford that gave him the idea. And, I was looking at the prototype with Steve, and I asked him, what are you going to do with this? What do you hope to do with this? And he said, I want some kid at Stanford to cure cancer in his dorm room. And I got chills because the passion and the belief in his eyes, he believed he could do it. And because he believed it, his team believed it. They were willing to try. This is Steve saying, hey, everybody, let's work nights and weekends till Christmas, and then we'll take a week off. This engineer in the back, Alex, pipes up, Steve, we already are working nights and weekends. Here's one of the one of the many unsung heroes in Silicon Valley, one of the true fearless geniuses and one of the women behind a lot of the technology in Silicon Valley that you don't hear about. This is Susan Kare, one of the great graphic designers who's still working today. But she designed the icons for the Mac. She became a co-founder at Next and oversaw the design of the icons for the Next computer. Years later, she was hired by Microsoft to redesign the Windows icons, and then IBM, when they were trying to battle Windows with OS/2, she did that and many other OSs. Notice the ankle-deep shit. This is a Steve Jobs to-do list at an offsite of some of the hard problems they were facing. I studied fine art and then became a photojournalist, but one of the things I also studied was visual anthropology, so I was trying to collect data. I had a feeling like I was discovering a hidden tribe and that this kind of stuff would be useful for someone to analyze later. It's worth noting that when I met Steve, this is Steve the dreamer. When I met Steve, I had been, as Jason mentioned, a photojournalist working around the world. I'd been kidnapped by rebels in Sudan. I had photographed the AIDS crisis, the homeless crisis. I'd been in forest fires and earthquakes and worked with drug gangs. I'd seen a lot of death, and I thought I knew something. I thought I was a pretty tough guy, but somehow being around Steve was absolutely terrifying. I had an existential crisis, my second, because I knew at some point the gaze of Mordor would come to me, even though I was on the sidelines trying to stay out of his sightline documenting. Everyone around Steve had to be on their A game and had to know what they were about. And I realized that I wasn't really ready to engage with Steve because I was actually a very immature person. I was hiding behind my camera like a lot of photojournalists. We don't really live, we just document. Photojournalists want to take pictures that change the world. They want to bring light to injustice. They want to help create cultural understanding. I was willing to die to make a picture that would change the world and improve the world. But I realized I had the opportunity to shoot the people, to take pictures of the people that actually were changing the world. That felt useful to me. That felt like it gave me a purpose. And once I understood that, Steve became a whole lot easier for me. And a couple of years later, when we actually had our first blowout screaming match argument, I was able to win that argument. I'm very proud. I'll tell you about that over a beer. This is about culture. This is about an expanding culture. Remember, when you went to Silicon Valley in the early days, you were talking about coats and ties. At HP and at the other companies, you would come in, it was 9 to 5. Suddenly, this new generation, with this hippie sensibility, comes in to meet the space race generation, and you can decorate your cube with obscene figures. Steve would come in and start doing these pep talks, but then they would devolve into rants sometimes. This was him really, really bitter and angry at John Scully and Apple, and talking about trying to crush Apple. This is an important set of pictures for me. This is capturing the interaction with an engineer. They're discussing this magnesium coating that Steve insisted be put on. That was very difficult. What I observed was if you're trying to build new technology, it's really, really hard. And there's like 20,000 parts. And you would have a meeting, and an engineer would present an idea that would be suggestion for a component or the gate array or some solution. And if Steve felt that that person was wrong, or he thought he was wrong, or he sensed that something hadn't been done, they hadn't done their homework, he would just rip into him and just attack them. If the person had spent a year working around the clock and had sacrificed everything to come up with that solution, they would know what they were about, and they would stand up to Steve and tell him, no, Steve, you're wrong. And this could go on for 10 or 15 minutes, and then suddenly Steve, with some inner mechanism, would be like, I can trust this person. It was really about trust, and suddenly he would just click off and go, okay, great, and he would move on. Like nothing ever happened. And Eddie Lee, one of his creative director, told me, he said, you know, with Steve, it wasn't personal, although I think it really was in many cases. But for Eddie, it wasn't personal. He said, and first of all, if you took the criticism personally, it would have no effect. He said, for Steve, it was always about making the thing better. Of course, there were times where he crossed the line and he left a lot of scars. I guess I should point it back that way. I like to say I went bald documenting Steve Jobs. This is Steve pretending to be human. I don't know if there's a reverse on this. Let's try that. This is funny. It's really rare to see him like just completely joyous, but he actually would bounce into work really happy every day. Even though he could be very difficult, very hurtful at times, he was also very charming and could be a very sweet guy when he wanted to. This is just about light. A lot of my peers thought I was crazy shooting in Silicon Valley because it was just boring white guys staring at computer screens. Why aren't you here in Africa shooting conflict? And I was like, yeah, it is really boring. It can be really boring. But every once in a while, you'd see something cool. This was, they actually announced the project in the fall, in October of 1988, but by the spring, they were still struggling to finish the factory, and they hadn't shipped units. They weren't even building the units yet. And Steve got a meeting with Canon. He wanted $100 million. They didn't want to give him that. He wanted their optical disk drive that no one was using, and he wanted their advanced robots, which he had promised to Ross Perot. But Steve came into this meeting wearing a sweater vest. Everybody else was dressed to the nines, and it was the era of Japanese dominance in business, and everyone was trying to respect the culture. And Steve came in, and it became very, very tense. And then the next thing you know, Steve started laying out 6 ridiculous demands, one after the other. It took about an hour that had nothing to do with the agenda of the meeting. The CEO of Canon is like, I need a break, and he walks out. Steve turns to his team and slams the table. You guys have fucked up this deal. And he storms out of the room. I didn't know what was going on. Nobody in the room knew what was going on. Fast forward to last year, and I'm interviewing people from back in the day, and I spoke to John Eisen. John told me he was walking down the hall, and he sees Steve standing outside the room laughing to himself. He's like, Steve, what are you laughing about? Steve's like, ha, ha, ha. I just made all these ridiculous demands, and now I'm going to go unwind them one by one. And he went back in the room, and he did. It took another hour, and one after another. At the end, Canon is victorious. They've crushed the mighty Steve Jobs. Suddenly, there was a power shift. There was a shift back because they were going to lose face. And the next thing you know, Steve got this $100 million and his optical disc, and he got the robots and everything he wanted, and they only got 17% of the company. Crazy. This is the first circuit board coming down the line. It was hard-earned, and Steve was so proud of the display there. This is Ross Perot greeting his fans. The second launch was at EduCom, but it was it was a huge hit with them at first, but then they found out it was going to be 10 grand, so they felt betrayed. Some of you may know on which computer the World Wide Web was invented at CERN in '91, and it was the next computer. Even though the hardware failed, ultimately, the OS and the software was incredibly elegant and a decade ahead of its time. And no one could have predicted. We thought the comeback would be easy for Steve, but no one could predict that he would be slogging through failure and struggle for 10 years. So now I want to take a little mental floss break and take you over to the cool cerebral calm of Adobe from the chaos of Next, where I lost my hair. I miss it. You had the Gutenberg press, 500 years go by, and suddenly you have PostScript. And John Warnock and Chuck Geschke leave Xerox PARC, and they start Adobe in 1982. And they wrote, I think it was 20,000 man-hours of code to create this page language description software. They didn't know anything about starting a business. Chuck told me this story recently. He said, and they had read one business book, and their plan wasn't to bring you PostScript and sell you fonts and really do desktop publishing per se. They were going to bring out a version of the Alto and sell you a computer system, a computer with a printer. In 1982, Steve Jobs shows up. And he says, my team, I'm doing this thing called the Macintosh, and I'm going to bring out a laser printer, and my team can't write the code. The same thing, actually, the month before, DEC had been there. And he goes, so how much for the company? And they're like, it's not for sale. What are you talking about? He goes, well, I need your code. How much for the company? They said, we're not selling the company. He goes, you guys are idiots. And he leaves. So Chuck calls, or John or Chuck, they call up Bill Hambrecht, who had got them the $2 million that they started Adobe with. And he says, you are idiots. Sell them the software. So they called Steve back. Steve ended up buying 19% of Adobe at a 5 times multiple of what they were worth, and then got a 5-year license on PostScript for the LaserWriter when it came out, thus ensuring Apple's success, actually, after Steve left. If they were to have sex, this is what it would look like. This is the hidden tribe. Russell Brown. The reason I think Photoshop became successful was his unbelievably smart evangelism, where he would bring in artists from around the world and teach them Photoshop. Perhaps funny, but for me, the hidden message is, how dare you take a vacation? Again, this is one of those moments. I'm all about documenting moments of human behavior to try and understand what's going on and express what people's lives are like. So this is one of those times where you actually saw human behavior inside a tech company. It was great. They later got divorced, unfortunately. It was too stressful. Technology. Okay, if I point down, I'll try that. They're not fooling anyone with these costumes. This is the great painter, David Hockney. In fact, Russell had brought him to the very first Photoshop Invitational in 1990, where he brought his dog and his cigarettes, and he created a piece of work that he left in the printer, which I now have in my house. Whenever I see this picture, I ask myself, why do we type with our thumbs? Probably some programmer at 3 in the morning writing code at Nokia to solve some problem. So I went over to Apple because Keith Yamashita called me and said they were doing this really cool handheld device that would allow you to organize all your stuff, and you could surf the internet, which wasn't called the internet quite. It was the early days. It was about 91. You could do email, AOL, and it would have handwriting. I was like, oh, I want to see this. This sounds really cool. I got to have this. I became completely sucked into this world, even though I was outside it. So I went to John, and I asked him if I could come in and document that and do a book about it. And he said, well, does that mean you're going to reveal our mistakes? And I said, yes. And he said, okay, well, maybe we'll learn something from that. So I think John gets a bad rap for forcing Steve out and for not being a technologist. A lot of people in the Valley malign him because he came in as a marketing guy. But he did grow the company from $800 million to $8 billion in the time from Steve left to about 93 when he left. And what was happening in the early 90s was Apple was already dead on its feet. They had these huge profit margins, but the Mac was losing market share like crazy. And it was outside the Apple, everyone thought it was this successful niche creative company, but inside they really couldn't innovate. They couldn't they were trying to rewrite the operating system, and it just wasn't happening. So Scully empowered this rebel unit inside Apple. He was looking for a way to create new revenue streams. And it was a rebel unit because the board didn't get it. They didn't want it. Nobody wanted a Newton. No one knew what it was for. This is Steve Capps, one of the true geniuses that I met. I met many. And the title is about all of these people that seem to have this sort of mountain climbing gene that I met that was just irrational. They were like war photographers in Silicon Valley. They were crazy. And they had either a genius for marketing or they had true intellectual genius. And Steve, his work, he helped write the Finder, and his work on user interfaces influenced the last 3 decades, I think, of interface design. But here he is playing his Jaminator, which allows him to play perfect guitar solos to his favorite tune. Sarah Clark was a programmer on the Newton team. This is the war room at Apple. And she had her baby, and I never saw her leave the building for like 2 years. I don't know if she actually did ever leave. But it was a crisis-driven project. They were on this huge deadline. And she would breastfeed behind a blanket in her cube and then sleep while the code was compiling. And Scully and Apple were ahead of the curve on diversity because they were putting women in places of power on the Newton team. And I kind of started to realize, why does diversity matter? It's because whoever writes the code controls our behavior. And the worldview of the coders was pretty narrow. They hadn't studied ancient history, perhaps, or philosophy. They were very, limited worldview kind of people in those days. And so if you brought in diversity, maybe you'd have different code and we'd have a different world. This is Woz showing the first Game Boy to John. This documents the very complicated relationship between engineering and marketing. How many product features are we going to have? Tricia Chan showed me here the power of PR. Apple PR, going back to Regis, is the best in the world. It was, I worked for the Washington Post, and I saw powerful people, and I, worked as a journalist for many years. I've never seen anything like Apple PR. This is a demo in Vegas for the Newton. There's 60 journalists outside waiting to get in, and somebody went up on stage and pressed the send button on the fax demo, and it crashed, and they can't get it back up. So when they started, they let the press in, and Tricia took a couple of journalists over to the side, and she brought Capps over, Steve Capps, and got it to work for these 2 journalists for important papers. They went back, reported that it was really cool. Stock went up 3 points. It's a lot of money. This is a cry for help within tech support in Austin. And it's a serious cry. Bad software hurts us all. So in the spirit of building hype, Apple was flying around the world telling people about the Newton. And this is at a demo in Germany, where Michael Chow, on the left, who is now heading the iPad marketing, Michael Chow is discovering that all 8 of the Newtons they brought more this time, are dead. Unfortunately, they've given the German press corps beer, and they're chanting now. In fact, going back to that slide, I think that was a demo where Michael Chow invented the phrase, "Imagine if you will." Now, this is top secret, and you can't really look at this, but this is actual operating system code. And this is what engineers do when it's 3 in the morning and they're smoking a joint or whatever. And this is defying gravity and absolute strict orders. Do not do this jump before Golden Master. And this is the bug hunt before Golden Master. They were going from beta to Golden Master with the OS. They had 30 people writing 1 million lines of code. And they had a year to do it. The stress level was off the charts. People were getting divorced. There was just all kinds of intensity. And they were late. And they brought in Gaston Bastiens from Philips to be the shipper. He was going to get this product out the door. But the first thing he did was he changed the chip. So he went to the team and he said, "You have to rewrite all that 1 million lines of code, and I'll give you another year," in a Belgian accent. Kohei Sona, who I spent a year shooting off and on, was responsible for the inker, which translated your pressure from the pen into the visual ink on the screen of the Newton. When he heard that they were going to have to rewrite all the code, he went home, he loaded a pistol, and he shot himself in the heart. He had just gotten married. The team was devastated. And it wasn't the only incident. Another person was hospitalized in the psych ward. I just think what this shows for me is people outside the Valley who use this technology, they just have no idea the sacrifice and the dedication that's involved in bringing new technology out. Without the money, you have no technology. And I was very fortunate in that Kleiner Perkins brought me in to document their operations for about 6 years off and on. And I shot a lot of the other VC firms in the Valley, and I really got my eyes open. But you have to understand, it was like a fire hose, as some of you may recall, of money coming into the Valley. In the 1970s, the total investment into the Valley was just in the millions. Even though you had huge companies like Intel and Lockheed or whatever, the outside investment coming in wasn't very much. By 1985, when I began my project, it was approaching $1 billion. So it was like very steep. By 1992, when I started shooting at Kleiner, it was $10 billion. And by 2000, that number would grow to $111 billion. It's just a shocking ton of money coming in from CalPERS and Wall Street and all over. So you had an explosion of innovation that was just off the charts. And John Doerr told me, they had done some kind of study, and they determined that they had created more wealth and jobs in Silicon Valley, had created more wealth and jobs during the time that I photographed from 85 to 2000 than at any time in human history. That was John with Bill Clinton. And this is Bill Joy, one of the true legendary programmers, one of my favorite people in all the years that I was there, explaining the internet in 1992 to William Randolph Hearst III. And he's like, "Get with the program." This was at a Kleiner offsite. Later that night, Bill said to me, "You have to get a website." I'm like, "What the hell is that? What are you talking about?" "No, I don't." And this is really cool because this is the Monday morning meeting. I was allowed to shoot in this secret, not secret, but this is a very important meeting where entrepreneurs would come and pitch, their elevator pitch, and then they would decide who they were going to invest in. And you look at the list of Kleiner Perkins, going back to Genentech, and Compaq, and Sun, and AOL, and Amazon, and At Home, and on and on and on. It's just a shocking run that they had. So I'm just going to go through this next one a little quickly because I want to get to the last segment. But, around the mid-'90s, you had just the rise of these new giants, like Microsoft and AOL and Sun and all these new companies were forcing the old giants like IBM and HP and Intel into positions where they were collaborating or competing directly. And I ended up shooting in a lot of those. In Microsoft, I went to IBM around in their R&D labs and a lot of different companies. Guess who said no one should ever pay more than $50 for a photo? Thank you, Bill. Destroyed the industry. The original geeks. Note the pocket protectors. Let's face it, a lot of what drove Silicon Valley was boys and their toys. There was so much growth. Sun was the first company or the fastest company to $1 billion. I shot Scott McNeely for the cover of Fortune. They were moving at that point. These are Pueblo Indians that Intel has trained in their fab. This was the most advanced fab at the time for chips. For some reason, Intel retained 75% of its workforce here in the US. I think it's like a moral decision. This is a chilling picture for me. I put it in because it's a little bit of the dark side. In those days, Silicon Valley was incredibly sexist, incredibly competitive. Oh, guess what? It hasn't changed that much. But the culture of work was changing. The very nature of work was changing. What it meant to be human was changing. But at Autodesk, because of that, you could now bring your dog to work. This is Bill Joy again. He wrote the code that DARPA used to be able to send emails during a nuclear attack for the Defense Department. And this is Bill finishing Java at his office in Aspen. And he showed me he had created line-of-sight Ethernet from his house on the hill down to his office down below, which is pretty advanced. This is not strategic. These are the maps that these are not the maps. These are the golf courses that Scott McNeely wants to play. Mark Andreessen, I think he wrote the second browser because the first one was in CERN. So the classic archetype in Silicon Valley is the visionary leader is forced out. And this is Samir Arora, one of my heroes. I had many heroes in Silicon Valley, but Samir is a classic entrepreneur, and he started this startup towards the end of the dot-com era, the last half of it, and it was to it was providing software so that you could make your own custom website. And they wanted to, and they were leading the market, and they were having great success for a couple of years. New employees were required to wear balloon hats. But then they started running out of time. And I love this picture. This is an important picture for me because this is the moment where a very, very happy board meeting where a lot of laughs were going on shifted when it became clear that the two VCs, their two investors, had a very different agenda for the meeting. And the agenda was, Samir, you're out. We want you to fire your president. Microsoft has now come in with front page. We don't agree with your direction. And we want you to go. The room was emptied, and I was left to photograph this incredible confrontation. I've never seen it. I shot over 70 companies. Most of them failed. A lot of different startups and all different permutations, and I was in a lot of different kinds of meetings. And I'd never seen anyone like this. And Samir just said, no, I have a vision for this. I know this will succeed if you can just hang in there with me. And they said, absolutely not. You're out. Just sign the papers. You'll be a consultant. And he said, screw you guys, forget it. And they told him, Samir, be real. You have 125 people. We just saw you give this big pep talk. And we saw the family you just moved here from Florida. You're going to have to go out there and give a talk saying that you're closing the company. Because guess what? It's 4 o'clock on Friday. At 5 o'clock, you're shut down. We're cutting you off. I left at that point because I always wanted to be able to come back, and it was just too brutal. It was unbelievable. Again, years later, I was having dinner a couple of years ago with Samir and his wife, and I said, so tell me the rest of the story. What happened? Because I knew he came back, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what really happened. And with tears rolling down his cheek, he told me the story. He goes, well, I went out and I made that talk. I had to tell the 125 people that I had just given a pep talk to that I was going to have to close the company. And I said, whoever can stay and stand by me, please stay, because I'm going to solve this. If you have to go, I understand. He went home, started dialing for dollars. By noon Monday, he had $10 million in the bank. And the best part of the story is, 3 months later, he engineered a sale to IBM, and his investors made 1,000% return on their money. And the guys that were trying to kick him out, he brought them back in. It was a big love fest. Everybody made dough. There is a caveat, though, because later IBM took the company public, and I was there for the IPO, and CNN came on the air and said that they were the first company to close lower than they opened. It was March of '99. And they said, is this the beginning of the end of the dot-com bubble? And it was. And trillions of dollars washed away. And that arc of amazing, glorious rise was crashing down. And I left. Ironically, at that same time, as Silicon Valley is crashing, Steve Jobs is coming out of the wilderness and rising up to the greatest heights, the greatest comeback in history, in American business history, I guess. The hard work that he did, never giving up on his dream, the OS, Apple bought it for $400 million, as you all know the story. But I found Steve to be the most inspirational person I ever met, and he changed my life. I had conflicts with Steve, and I have scars from Steve, and when he died, I started to reevaluate things and just try to see the totality of it, of the man, and just leave it at that. He was a complicated person, but he really inspired me because, he never gave up. And I have quite a few dark nights of the soul with this project, and it's probably his fault because he's haunting me, because he told me I was going to have a lot of fun with these pictures someday. So, in conclusion, what's coming next? The future. This is a very exciting time, but I am worried. I have a few concerns. We face some challenges, particularly around education and how we fund innovation. And I'd like to just put those out there, just as my 2 cents. Hold on, there's a slide missing. We got that one. Oh, there's a slide missing. So who will be the next Steve Jobs? And where will she come from? Well, I don't think it's going to be from the USA unless we reform our education system pretty soon. Chuck Geschke told me we graduated fewer doctorates of computer science last year than 1970. China graduated 20,000 engineers. And there's a lot of amazing innovation going on right now, but much of it seems to be very short term. It's mostly about apps. And the great entrepreneur Judy Estrin posited that there was a giant brake put on innovation during the dot-com era, after the dot-com era collapsed, because everybody shifted from this patient, long-term investment into this short-term IPO, get your money out in 18 months, and that's been kind of institutionalized. So it's not maybe enough time to really make those breakthroughs. Because when I think about it, I can't think of a single innovation since 2000, when I ended my project, that has scaled up to create millions of jobs here in the US, jobs that pay for college educations. And a famous VC said to me, I won't tell you who, but he said, it's too late for America. We've gutted, our financial system is gutted, our education system is broken, and we're putting all our investment in India and China. Well, I don't believe we're doomed. Silicon Valley is the greatest engine of economic growth the world has ever seen. Very creative engine. And the people I photographed back in the day, they were on a mission to invent the impossible. They were passionate, idealistic, obsessed. They were willing to sacrifice anything for the power of their ideas. And what did I take away from that? Well, it ties back to my existential crisis about the meaning of life. If you want to do anything meaningful in this world, you have to find something you truly believe in with your heart and soul. You have to be willing to die for it, I think, to really make that breakthrough. You have to be on a mission. And why is that important? Because the dragons are real. As you all know, it's really, really hard to invent new technology and to bring it to market and to build a company. It's ridiculously, breathtakingly hard. But the good news is I'm seeing all the signs of life, and the passion that I saw back in the 80s, I feel like it's coming back. Right here in this room, obviously. This is so exciting. And the people I met at the D School last week, the young people, there is this feeling of another wave is coming. They come every 25, 30 years. I mean, can we catch the wave? Yes, I think we can. And whether it's green tech or quantum computing, whatever it is, you can't stop innovation. It's coming back. So, Fearless Genius is your story, really. This is your heritage. This is your tribe. Never give up on your dreams. Keep fighting for them. Go out and change the world and complete the mission. Thank you very much.